presidency of Thomas Jefferson ushered in 25 years of Democratic, Republican control of the executive branch. Jefferson's administration rapidly worked to undo the damage they felt Washington and Adams administrations had done. Jefferson worked to reduce the accumulated debt, cutting the bud as low as he possibly could. He reduced the Army and Navy and removed the whiskey tax, which had plagued Washington's presidency. Like Washington and Adams, Jefferson had to contend with piracy. In the Mediterranean, he employed an American naval squadron. You soundly defeat the Barbary pirates and force them to capitulate. Unlike his predecessors, Jefferson actively worked with the new French government, now under the control of Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte looking to make quick cash and to offload some old colonial holdings, sold the Louisiana Territory to Jefferson's administration. In 1803, opening an entirely new frontier for Americans. The following year, Jefferson employed the Corps of Discovery, led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, to mount an expedition up the Missouri River and over the Continental Divide. Their goals were to map the new territory, to find a practical route across the western half of the continent, and to establish an American presence in the West before Europeans got the chance to claim territory. Aided by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who served as an interpreter, the party made contact with over 70 of the Indian tribes, produced 140 maps, and documented more than 200 new plants and animal species. Jefferson's second term was marred by the Napoleonic Wars raging in Europe. Both British and French navies now actively attacked American ships and sailors, resulting in violations of America's neutral shipping rights. In response, Jefferson employed an embargo on American shipping. It was wildly unpopular and even more wildly unsuccessful, damaging Jefferson's attempts to balance the budget. Before his second term was up, despite the unpopularity the Democratic Republicans faced at the end of Jefferson's administration, his protege James Madison was elected as the fourth President of the United States. Madison, who would been instrumental during the Constitutional Convention, inherited a complicated and messy relationship with England and France, and mounting tension within the United States. Madison continued Jefferson's embargo for the first 2 years of his presidency, realizing that trade was necessary for the betterment of the United States. And at the behest of Congress, Madison reopened American shipping to France and England, asking them once again to honor America's neutrality. Naturally, the capturing of ships and impressment of sailors began again. Almost immediately, a group of young congressmen, namely two gentlemen named Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, hounded the president for a stronger show of force. Known as War Hawks, Clay, Calhoun and their faction demanded Madison to take a more militant stance toward Britain and France, increased tension on the American interior. Added to the fire, British agents had been suspected of arming and supplying a native uprising on the frontier. And British troops still held forts, which belonged to the United States. After British ships blatantly attacked, American sailors immediately off the American coast Madison gave into the war hawks and asked the Congress to declare war. On June 1st, 1812, the American people may have been ready for war with Britain, but its army and navy were not. In 3 separate invasions of Canada, the United States was defeated and beaten back, with 2 out of 3 armies forced to surrender, although not without some success. One of the invasions had resulted in the burning of the city of York, the provincial capital in Canada. Naval battles fared much better. In one instance, the USS Constitution and the HMS Guerriere faced off in a swift naval engagement lasting less than an hour. The British were horrified to find that their cannonballs bounced harmlessly off of the Constitution's 22-inch hull. The USS Constitution would go on to wreak havoc among the British Navy. Throughout the war, many native tribes had banded together under the leadership of the Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, and his brother, Tenskwatawa, or Lalawethika, known as the Prophet Tecumseh's Confederacy of Tribes, sided with the British in the last desperate gamble to establish control over the continued American expansion west. The British and Tecumseh's Confederacy kept the American military at bay in Canada, where Tecumseh was ultimately killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. Tecumseh's death fractured the Confederacy of Tribes and ultimately drew them out of the war. The British, on the other hand, turned on the offensive and attacked American positions along the Chesapeake, aiming to capture the United States capital, Washington, D.C., in August 1814. The British successfully sailed up the Patuxent River south of Washington and landed troops, who marched toward the U.S. capital city. A disastrous defense of the city at Bladensburg left Washington sea open to attack and occupation in the White House. As Madison was forced to evacuate and watch the disaster from afar, his wife, Dolly Madison, realized that if the British captured the city, they would wreak havoc and likely set fire to the various government buildings. Mrs. Madison had her enslaved servant, Paul Jennings, take down and secure the famous copy of the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, which hung prominently in the White House. Dolly's precaution proved prophetic, as when the British troops occupied Washington, they did indeed set numerous government buildings ablaze, including the still under construction U.S. Capitol, the Treasury, the Department of War, and White House. As the city burned, a well-timed hurricane rushed up the coast, putting out the fires, and in one recorded case, picked up 2 cannons and threw them several yards away, killing both British soldiers and American civilians. While the British had successfully taken and burned the U.S. Capitol, they were forced to abandon the city as controlling it would not be possible without additional reinforcement, and the hurricane had severely damaged their fleet. On the Patuxent River, Madison returned to the ruined capital and continued to prosecute the war. The following month, British naval efforts to capture the city of Baltimore were thwarted at the siege of Fort McHenry, where British vessels bombarded the fort through a vicious battle which lasted into the night. In the morning at Reveille, Fort McHenry ran up its oversized star-spangled banner flag as it prepared for another day of fighting. Instead, the British fleet sailed back out to sea, unwilling to engage more American positions and begin diverting their resources for an attack on New Orleans. In Louisiana, the siege of Fort McHenry and the sight of the oversized American flag on the morning of September 14, 1814, inspired American lawyer Francis Scott Key to pen a poem titled The Defense of Fort McHenry. The words of the poem, set to the tune of an old British drinking song, would go on to become the national anthem of the United States, the Star-Spangled Banner. The British made one last attempt to make an offensive effort into the American mainland, near the city of New Orleans in Louisiana, hoping to get control of the Mississippi River. British forces landed several miles south of New Orleans and attempted to march on the city. The defense of the city was organized by a fiery commander named Andrew Jackson, whose hodgepodge assembly of defenders included pirates, militia, free blacks, and regulars. In January 1815, unaware that the United States and England had concluded negotiations for a peace treaty in December 1814, British forces marched on New Orleans and engaged in one last battle. Jackson's ragtag defenders held off several waves of British troops and won an incredible, if somewhat belated, victory for the United States. Although the War of 1812 is little known today, it had many lasting impacts across for the United States and the people of North America. Without question the greatest, the effect on the war was not any territory gained, but rather the definitive end of any hope for the Native Americans to establish any kind of sovereignty over their land. As part of the treaty, the British had pushed for the establishment of an Indian state in the Great Lakes region, but the United States had outright rejected the plan. The dam was about to burst for Western expansion, and there was nothing and no one left to stop the tide from sweeping away the native tribes still standing on a global scale. Most of the European powers had assumed the United States would not be able to last. The great experiment would have run its course. In these backward words, farmers and high-headed intellectuals would have torn the country apart. Instead, on a very public world stage, the United States said again, declared war on the most powerful empire in the world, and fought them to a standstill. While there was very little territory gained by the Treaty of Ghent, the statement was clear. The United States was here, and they were here to stay. At least as long as it could stay together. As the 19th century progressed, many Americans became enamored with the concept of continentalism, a belief that the United States would want. They stretch from sea to shining sea and cover the North American continent. The Treaty of Ghent did very little to enhance the territory owned by the United States. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, although O.H. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase had increased the territory owned by the United States all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Political treaties with Spain and Great Britain helped to expand and clarify these borders. Through the 1820s, and Americans became increasingly ravenous to fulfill this continental dream. At the same time, President James Monroe's 1823 warned European powers that the Western Hemisphere was no longer theirs to play with, and that the United States would exert its influence as the major power in the region if they attempted to colonize here again. The message was clear, and an idea began to take shape in the minds of the American people. This land is not for the Europeans, and it never was. It is destined for the people of the United States. The term manifest destiny first appeared during the 1840s during growing conflict over control of the Oregon Territory, what has come to encompass the entire era of westward expansion for the United States. Believing that they were unquestionably destined to inhabit the entire continent, and looking for a chance to redeem what some believed was Americans looked to spread their values and their economy beyond the Mississippi River and reform the West into an evangelical version of the agrarian East. In their way stood the proud remnants of Native American tribes of the East and the tribes of the West, now unwilling to give any more ground without a fight. Additionally, the few European colonies still standing in North America, namely Great Britain and Spain, as well as by 1824, a newly independent Mexico would not simply roll over and allow the United States to expand unchecked. When he purchased the Louisiana Territory, President Jefferson wanted to establish lasting diplomatic relationships with the myriad of tribes in the West, and as became the custom through the 19th century, hoped to civilize and assimilate the tribes into American society. It did not take long, however, for plans to assimilate the Native Americans, becoming plans to remove and relocate them, especially in the aftermath of the War of 1812. As early as 1824, under the presidency of James Monroe, plans were drafted for the creation of Indian territories, which would force the Cherokee Indians to abandon their ancestral land east of the Mississippi River and move west in 1829. President Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812, made those plans a reality, convincing the Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. In 1830, the act forced the 5 civilized tribes, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee, to abandon their lands and move west. It was an act of forced displacement, with more than 60,000 people removed from their homes and relocated beyond the Mississippi River. The removal saw a few minor conflicts, but ultimately the tribes were coerced into leaving. Known as the Trail of Tears, the routes taken by these tribes were difficult and resulted in the deaths of around 15,000 natives. Pioneers made the journey westward to farm, mine and ranch, often finding the land inhospitable and dangerous. During their journeys, they faced skirmishes with Native Americans, diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever, punishing winters without food and other hardships. About 70,000 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints emigrated to the Salt Lake Valley from their homes in Illinois, beginning in 1847, known as the Mormon Exodus. Thousands of immigrants used the Oregon Trail, a 2,000-mile route from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. Land speculators would sell cheap lots with promises of unbounded opportunity, inspiring thousands to make the journey. In the winter of 1846, 47 members of the infamous Donner Party were traveling by wagon train west on the Oregon Trail, but became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The party members were forced to resort to cannibalism to survive. The overland journey was so risky and difficult that some westward emigrants opted for the 6-month route by sea around Cape Horn at the tip of South America. Instead, in 1848, gold was discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, which had the same year become part of the U.S. as the consequence of the Mexican-American War. Once word got out about the gold men from near and far sought their fortunes in the Sierra Nevada foothills in what became known as the Gold Rush. In 1849, San Francisco's population skyrocketed from 812 to 20,000 people, with those prospectors arriving that year becoming known collectively as the 49ers. The prices for land, goods and services skyrocketed. People stood to make more money selling those goods and services to prospectors than from actually mining for gold, because men outnumbered women in these towns greatly. Traditional women's work, like washing clothes and cooking, became highly in demand and therefore highly profitable. Nevertheless, actual gold was certainly found. The rush produced on average 76 tons of gold per year, and by the end of the 1850s, it was estimated that $550 million worth of gold had been mined, worth of about $187 billion in today's dollars. The thousands who had moved west needed fast mail service for letters and news from the east, while several mail carriers over the Rocky Mountains existed. The most famous was the Pony Express. Founded in 1860, the service used relays of horse-mounted riders riding at breakneck speed, day and night, to carry mail between Missouri and California, which it could. In about 10 days, it only operated for 18 months. before the first transcontinental telegram. The Transcontinental Railroad was established in 1861, but it was vital for connecting the new state of California with the rest of the U.S. as Americans began to settle west. More conflicts with the existing Native American tribes led to further violence, and the United States military became nearly permanently quartered in various forts across the Midwest and along the West Coast. The Texas Territory in the American Southwest had been ceded to Spain in the 18. But following the Mexican War of Independence in 1821 and the official formation of the Mexican Republic, just 3 years later, the territory became part of Mexico. Texas was far away from the center of the Mexican government, in Saltillo, and had fewer than 4,000 people living across the vast territory, looking to increase immigration to the state and hoping these subs can rise in population would deter Indian raids. The government offered cheap land and considerable financial benefits for those who would take residence in the state. Many of those who immigrated came from the American South and brought with them the culture and mentality of the region, including slavery in 1829. Mexico abolished slavery, and after the Anglo citizens nearly revolted, the Mexican president also banned any further immigration to Texas by citizens of the United States. In Texas, the English citizens ignored the laws and rapidly began to outnumber the Mexican-born population in the state when in 1834. And Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led a successful coup of the Mexican government. The Texans were initially pleased, as Santa Anna quickly undid many of the acts and laws of his predecessors. However, Santa Anna went much further and disbanded the political bodies of each of the Mexican states, imposing a dictatorship over the country. In 1835, with support from both the Anglos and Tejanos populations, the Texans rebelled, looking to secure independence for Mexico. In late February 1836, the most famous battle of the Texas Revolution began with the siege of the Alamo Mission, defended by fewer than 300 Texans. The walls of the mission had been turned into a makeshift fort. Its defenders included Colonel William Travis, James Bowie, and former U.S. Congressman and folk legend Davy Crockett. The Texans were surrounded on all sides and besieged for 13 days by Santa Anna's army. Before the final night attack on March 6, 1836, the battle was brutal, and Santa Anna ordered for there to be no prisoners taken. The handful of prisoners who managed to survive the massacre were executed as well. The Battle of the Alamo became a rallying cry for the Texans still fighting, and fueled the Texas Army in the weeks which followed. A little more than a month later, the Texas Revolution ended in victory for the people of Texas. After the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836, the Texas Revolution lasted less than a year and saw the creation of the Republic of Texas. Naturally, the predominantly American population immediately began petitioning the government of the United States to annex the new republic and add it to the growing Union, despite fierce arguments over the admittance of what would undeniably be another slave state into the Union. It took less than a decade before Texas was annexed by the United States. The annexation of Texas sparked yet another conflict with Mexico in 1846 because the borders of the Republic of Texas were undefined and disputed by Mexico. When the United States annexed Texas, Mexico claimed that the United States was taking Mexican land. President James K. Polk attempted to negotiate with the Mexican government, offering to pay for the disputed territory, in addition to the California, New Mexico, and Arizona territories. However, the Mexican government refused. In response, Polk sent troops to occupy the disputed territory, causing Mexican forces to attack the small American force. Polk used the affair to convince Congress to declare war on Mexico. Mexico's army was equipped with surplus flintlock firearms from the Napoleonic era, while the United States was armed with far more modern weaponry, disorganized, undersupplied, and facing internal political strife at every level of management. The Mexican forces were little to no match for the American Army and Navy, who made quick work conquering vast sections of Mexico and its territories. When the Mexican government finally collapsed, they were forced to surrender large swaths of territory to the United States, including California and New Mexico, in addition to suffering the indignity of having to recognize the sovereignty of the Republic of Texas and its subsequent annexation in 1845. Lasting from April 1846 to February 1848. The Mexican-American War proved to be a one-sided one, and clearly displayed America's ambitions to secure control of the North American continent. There were many dissidents to the concept of manifest destiny, especially within the Whig Party, the successors of the Federalists, including by the mid-19th century, a young Illinois politician, Abraham Lincoln, in 1844. Manifest destiny took center stage as territorial disputes with Great Britain over Oregon and the ongoing tensions with Mexico over the Texas territory split political parties. Further, as Western territories grew in population and were being considered for admission to the Union, whether these areas would allow or ban slavery became a crucial question. The fragile balance of power in Congress between slave states and free states was at risk. Since the first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619, the institution of slavery had grown more and more ingrained in the culture and economy of the United States, particularly in the South. While the United States government had abolished the slave trade in 1808, it had introduced a form of chattel slavery within its borders, ensuring generations of African Americans remained working Well, there had been a few slave rebellions across the United States in the early 19th century, including Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion. None had succeeded through the early 19th century. Some slaves attempted to escape and fled north, hoping to find sanctuary in the pro-abolition states of the Northeast. Or in Canada, they traveled north on a series of secret routes to known abolitionist locations and safe houses, known as the Underground Railroad. The pathway north was dangerous, and those brave enough to flee bondage were aided by fellow escaped slaves, freedmen and women, and anti-slavery sympathizers. One such individual was Harriet Tubman. Tubman had escaped slavery herself in 1849 and spent many years after aiding more than 70 slaves escaping slavery in the South. As the issue of slavery pressed closer and closer to a breaking point, so too did the tension within the federal government. In 1854, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks caned Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. Pro-slavery sympathizers from around the country knew canes congratulating him. Abolitionists saw the public attack as the embodiment of the control the South seemed to have over the country. Could they simply do whatever they wanted and expect nothing but compromise? In return, the polarization of the country was made perfectly clear as a result of the incident. It had taken years of agreements and compromises to come to this stalemate. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise declared that Missouri would be a new slave state, and Maine is a new free state, and that slavery would be prohibited north of the southern boundary of Missouri, in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. The fragile balance was preserved. Texas joined in 1844 as a slave state, and Oregon was admitted in 1846 as a free state. When the U.S. won more than 1 million square miles of territory from Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War in 1848. Volatile debate occurred over whether the new territories would allow slavery. The U.S. gained all of present-day California, Texas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah as a result of that fight. The resulting agreement said that California would be a free state, and the slave trade, but not slavery, would be abolished in Washington, D.C., but a new Fugitive Slave Act would enable Southerners to reclaim runaway slaves who had escaped across borders to free states. The agreement allowed the rest of the areas to determine for themselves whether to allow slavery in 1854. Two new states, Kansas and Nebraska, were set to be established in the Louisiana Purchase area. But Southern legislators objected because, according to the terms of the Missouri Compromise, both states would be free. A new compromise called for popular sovereignty, or once again allowing the settlers of the territories to determine the question for themselves. The battle for Kansas and Nebraska came to embody the soul of the nation. People flooded to the territories and tried to influence the vote, many of them voting illegally. Soon Kansas spiraled into civil war, a conflict that killed hundreds and which became known as Bleeding Kansas. Among those who had joined in the violence was one of the most notorious freedom fighters in American history, John Brown. Brown was a radical preacher and a staunch abolitionist. He had on multiple occasions attempted to incite an armed slave rebellion, and in Kansas ramped up the violence to such an extent that he and his followers hacked 5 Kansas slave owners to death with broadswords. Brown then began planning a raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia, hoping to once again inspire the enslaved peoples of the South to rise up against their oppressors. He planned on capturing the armory and arsenal in Harper's Ferry in addition to the rifle factory. In order to arm his rebellion, Brown's raid commenced in October 1859 and was swiftly put down by the United States Army. The U.S. forces led by a young colonel named Robert E. Lee quickly surrounded the engine house Brown's men had occupied, and after Brown refused to surrender, took the building by force. Brown was tried and executed for treason by the state of Virginia, and in so doing became a martyr for anti-slave forces around the country. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a defining moment for the country. It seemed now inevitable that there would be some great conflict to decide the fate of the nation. The election of 1860 was the final straw for the South. Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln ran on a platform of liberal policies, which included raising tariffs, infrastructure improvements, and expanding the railroads. While Lincoln was an abolitionist and vehemently opposed slavery, he understood that the issue would inevitably tear the country apart, and had initially promised to do everything in his power to keep the South from breaking away from the Union. Lincoln's election to the presidency, however, was enough for some Southern states to make the break. In December 1860, South Carolina led the charge and succeeded. From the United States, other Southern states quickly followed, and sitting President James Buchanan faced a growing disaster. As Southern states seceded, they began to confiscate federal forts and arsenals, which belonged to the United States military. One such location was Fort Sumter in South Carolina. President Buchanan had been unwilling to resupply the garrison, and when Lincoln took office, he faced a near impossible decision. Lincoln, unwilling to surrender an American fort to the rebels or recognize their authority, sent a letter to the governor of South Carolina, informing him that a ship carrying food but no ammunition would attempt to resupply the fort. This allowed Lincoln the satisfaction of knowing that if the South fired on the fort, they would be the aggressor in any conflict, and if they did not, he would have made strides in negotiating with the rebels, as well as holding the fort. It was not to be on April 9th. Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered General P. G. Beauregard to take the fort before the supplies would arrive.